This is the morning brief from the Economic Times.
Hey, so my name is Anshul Goel Batra and my blog name is My Multifaceted Diary. When it comes to paying taxes on barter things or freebies that cost over 20k, it might change little thing for quite many people around there, and the brand would think a lot before approaching an influencer, because I'm quite sure not many would be fine for paying something and even promoting.
That end of season sale with the best discounts, the toothpaste which makes your teeth whiter instantly, or that bar which serves you the most exotic cocktails. Smart lines constantly telling us, influencing us from every possible screen we're on about fashion, food, travel, lifestyle, and whatnot. On our phones and laptops, on Instagram, YouTube, blogs, Twitter, ShareChat, and everywhere else we look, either subtly or upfront.
Amaji loves Bikaji, loves Bikaji.
It's been the case for at least 2 years. But some things changed last month, which have created quite a stir within the entire fraternity of influencers, endorsers, and ad agencies. The Central Consumer Protection Authority, or the CCPA, under the Ministry of Consumer Affairs, issued a set of sweeping new guidelines to curb misleading ads and endorsements in early June with immediate effect.
The Central Consumer Protection Authority, under the Department of Consumer Affairs, has notified guidelines for prevention of misleading advertisements and endorsement for misleading advertisements. Now, these guidelines seek to ensure that consumers are not being fooled with unsubstantiated claims, exaggerated promises, misinformation, and false claims.
The guidelines say endorsers and influencers are now legally accountable for all the ads they endorse and all their brand-related social media posts and promotions. They need to give proof of due diligence about claims they've made in ads. These million-odd influencers also have to disclose material connection, equity shareholding, or profit sharing with brands they're linked with. Violations can attract court cases, penalties, and outright bans. So far, the guidelines were under the watch of the Advertising Standards Council of India, or the ASCI, which has no legal authority. Separately, starting July 1st, social media influencers need to pay 10% tax on freebies worth more than 20,000 rupees under a new income tax rule. These could include computers, cars, jewelry, or foreign trips. So what does all this government scrutiny mean? And how is the influencer economy reacting? To unravel what's behind all the glitz on the screens, I invited Anusha Shetty, chairperson of ad agency Grey Group and co-founder of digital marketing company Autumn Grey. Also joining me is Gautam Madhavan, who at 21 set up Mad Influence, an influencer marketing company which works with some 50,000 influencers and mega companies like Dharma Productions and Sony Music. I also have with me Bharat Chugh, advocate and legal expert who deals with the gamut of consumer-facing and corporate cases. It's Thursday, July 28th. I'm Ratna Bhushan from the Economic Times, and you're listening to Socially Acceptable Influencers Get a Reality Check on the Morning Brief. Anusha, as an advertiser, are you seeking clarity on the guidelines? Many are saying that there are multiple gray areas.
I'm sure all advertisers have questions. Anything new will obviously bring questions, and that's when the clarity comes in. ASCII is also, kind of published the guidelines a little earlier, and more or less the guidelines seem to be in the same space. I think we are kind of clear on this. But will we have questions at some point? We may.
So, Gautam, how are influencers reacting to all these guidelines?
Influencers are not in favor of this for sure. But I am in favor of them because it is good for them in the long run. It's very good for the micro and nano influencers because it gives them like more credibility in the market if they follow these guidelines in the future.
Significant point there, Gautam. The influencers are resisting some of these new rules. Why?
See, they've been working without guidelines, and suddenly, like from an organizational perspective, for us, it might be not a big change because we just need to implement one or two guidelines. But from an influencer perspective, technically they're not organizations; they are freelancers. So for a freelancer, they seldom have a team, and they just go with the flow. So for this, I think this adds more layers to their current work, and they basically don't want to like complicate their lives to for them now. So yes, that is the reason why they're not in the favor of this.
So then, are such stringent legal guidelines necessary in the first place?
I think it is necessary. The influencers have been always the last leg of any marketing. On a daily basis, we do say 12 to 14 campaigns. That's the run rate that we are at. So from various categories, it could be FMCG, it could be finance, it could be tech, it could be electronics, it could be platforms, it could be something else, it could be food. So yeah.
Similar guidelines by ASCII have been in place for a while but have never been legally binding. The debate over disclosures and accountability has been brewing for over a year now, as the Morning Brief had highlighted in an episode last year. Bharat, what changes now with the government stepping in?
So a lot changes. As we're aware, the ASCII guidelines were not legally enforceable, so there were no consequences for any non-compliance by the endorsers. But now there are very, very serious consequences, not just for the manufacturers and the suppliers, but also for the endorsers. And now there are very, very clear duties on the endorsers to, for instance, disclose any material connection that they have with the company or the manufacturer who's selling the product. For instance, if they're shareholders or directors, or they have an equity in the company which has made the product, they have to very clearly disclose that. They have to disclose if this is a paid endorsement. They have to disclose if there is any other underlying interest. So broadly, anything that affects the weight and credibility of what they say and their endorsement, any connection, any underlying interest that impairs that or affects that has to be disclosed now. And the endorsers also have been obligated now to undertake due diligence into the product or the service that they are endorsing. So they have to verify and test and satisfy themselves as to the veracity of the claim that the advertisement is making. They'll have to ensure that what they say in an endorsement reflects their own genuine opinion about the product. For instance, they can't say they've used the product if they haven't. Also, they cannot say that the product is good or effective if they used the product, for instance, about 20 years back. So they'll have to ensure whatever that they say reflects their genuine opinion and their reasonably current opinion. And in absence of this due diligence, and if they do not disclose the material connection that I just spoke about earlier, they face direct liability now, in addition to the liability that the manufacturer or the supplier may face. So this is something that has changed. Now, of course, there are some questions which are unanswered in terms of how do you make that disclosure? To what details do you need to go? What is the extent of due diligence that you have to do as an endorser before endorsing a product? Some of those questions are unanswered, but I think as we go along, those details would be fleshed out. We'll have more in terms of judicial decisions, laying out with precision the scope and ambit of this due diligence, for instance. But for now, suffice it to say that there are certain very, very clear duties on endorsers which are also legally enforceable.
So, Anusha, are these guidelines enforceable, or will it be business as usual for the majority of influencers? There are so many brands across social and mainstream media making claims every day.
Like you said, there are many people, specifically in the influencer game, from a micro influencer to a macro influencer. There are lots of people, and it will take time. The agenda is to make every advertiser conscious and responsible for their actions. So it's important for everybody, whether an advertiser or a brand or even an influencer or brand ambassador, to be conscious and responsible for what they do. At the end of the day, why is this happening? The idea is to protect the consumer. We don't want the consumer to feel misled. That's the larger goal, and that's where all these guidelines and governing bodies are going.
Gautam, would you like to add to that? You work with thousands of influencers.
If you look at the large numbers, nobody's following the ASCII guidelines for now. So agencies like us, like Mad Influence, whenever we do a brand campaign, we make sure our creators or influencers or celebs make sure that they put a hashtag ad or hashtag sponsored to follow the ASCII guidelines. Now we work with the platforms directly, right? Like ShareChat, YouTube, Instagram. So we already have guidelines in terms of, hey, these are the things that you should be careful about, and like we should try and enforce it together. So it is basically a space where we work with the creators and the platform together to make this legally happen. And it is not going to be like a overnight journey. It is going to take time.
ASCII has called out a dozen A-list endorsers for violating its code. Amitabh Bachchan recently wrote on his Instagram and Tumblr accounts that several of his posts have been given notices about what he promotes, and that there are strict rules now by the government on what can be endorsed. Else it is becoming illegal. It's a tough life, he wrote. So, Anusha, how are the endorsers and influencers reacting to these new guidelines? Are they worried about possible legal fallouts?
Large brands do want to work within the whole scope of being ethical and transparent. In the influencer game, particularly, they're already aware. Agencies like ours are already bringing this to their notice. So the influencer game is very different, right? It's meant to be ad hoc, it's meant to be one off, it's meant to be a specific project, and the influencer exits the relationship. The brand ambassador relationship is a long term relationship. Contracts are already signed, or new terms are being signed. That's the space that the brands may worry a bit, because it really depends on how the ambassadors react to a change like this. My belief is large celebrities and endorsers will understand that this is good for the consumer, and they will realign themselves into the space. And they will drive the change for the micro influencers and the rest of the industry. It will take time, but it will happen.
Which brings me to the statistic. ASCII put out a report which says the period between January to May this year saw some 23% violations by prominent names. And these people represent some really large brands. I'm not even talking about the smaller brands here.
That's true. See, some of these contracts may already be in place. Nobody wants to break a rule. Change takes time. His job is to bring to their notice that there is a deviation, and the change will come into play. A lot of these contracts are already in place, and these guidelines are new. It will take time for people to transform into the place they need to be.
Many are saying that putting the entire responsibility on the celebrity or the influencer is unfair, since it is the company and the agency which is actually making the ad. Bharat, I'd like to ask you, legally, which of the two sides is better placed? Is it the celebrity or the company?
So I think the responsibility should lie with both, and it does lie with both under the present law. For instance, the manufacturers or the service providers who come out with anything that may be characterized as a false or a misleading advertisement, they are also liable under the law. And in fact, the liabilities on them are much graver. So, for instance, apart from being asked to discontinue the goods or services or rectify their ads, they can be asked to pay heavy penalties. And there is also a stipulation for a punishment or an imprisonment for up to 2 years on the manufacturer or the service provider for false and misleading advertisements. So the penalties are much greater on the companies. Having said that, the celebrities or the endorsers are liable too, and should be liable too, in my opinion, because an endorser gets paid for the endorsement, and the company is also leveraging on the persuasion or the influence of the celebrity. And I believe with great power and with great influence comes great responsibility. And a celebrity should also be held accountable for what they say and for the endorsements that they make. And it cannot be a defense for a endorser to say that they said whatever was there in a script and they should not be held accountable. So given the impact, given the persuasion, or given the uh, influence that they have on people, I think there should be some accountability, and in the present system both are held accountable.
But in cases where the celebrities are found to be violating the guidelines, what kind of legal tangles do they face?
So they can be asked to immediately discontinue the advertisement or modify the advertisement. That's one. But the real consequence is that if they are found to be engaging in any false or misleading advertisement or having lent their voice to it, after an investigation, a penalty of up to 10 lakhs may be imposed on them for the first violation that they commit. And if there are any subsequent violations too by the same influencer, the penalty may be for as much as 50 lakhs. And so this is the penalty aspect. Any violations of the guidelines may also lead to a ban or a prohibition on the endorser. So they can be banned from endorsing any goods or services for a period of up to 1 year. And again, if this is an endorser who's repeatedly violated the guidelines, there can be a ban for up to 3 years. So these are some of the consequences. And in fact, not just that, if there is any endorser or an influencer who's not complied with any of the above directions, for instance, of payment of fine, or violates the ban, or somebody who does not discontinue the false or misleading advertisement, they can also, in that situation, suffer imprisonment for up to 6 months and have a criminal prosecution too. So these are the broad consequences. Of course, in extreme cases where the advertisement is so false and misleading and the gravity of the case is such, even the criminal law may kick in. And in a given case, an influencer may also be prosecuted for the offense of cheating under the Indian Penal Code if by their actions it can be substantiated or made out that the influencer has induced somebody to part with their property, and there was a dishonest or a fraudulent intention underlying. Then in those extreme cases, even the criminal law can kick in.
So, Anusha, you said a lot of contracts are already in play. So, what about the new ones? Are companies redoing them with more stringent clauses about disclosures and due diligence?
As we speak, I can tell you lots of them are discussing this. Are they worried? Of course, they're worried. But everybody is discussing how to handle a situation like this and how they can move to a place where they can work within the guidelines yet do a great job with their brands. Are they all done? Is there no anxious feeling around this whole space? There is. It is important that the world understands that this is being done for the consumer, and we need to kind of align ourselves to the guidelines. Even as a citizen, I need to be responsible and conscious to things around me. It could be the environment, it could be anything. Similarly, in a space of endorsements, the need to be conscious and responsible is important. There are frustrations for sure, but it is being discussed.
Crucial point there. But how are social media platforms reacting to the guidelines?
The platforms have made it easier for the influencers and for the brands to create this authenticity and transparency. The very fact that the platforms have made it easy for both brands and influencers to be transparent means that they are part of the guidelines and they are part of this whole change. Let me draw a parallel. In the past, if you looked at certain digital articles, for example, which were sponsored content, the content had to end with a line saying this is sponsored content. Now, this is a manual act of putting it together, but the platforms have created features which allow us to kind of disclose very easily. Take an Instagram, for example. The minute I put a content there, and if it's an endorsement, then, it's very easy for me to call out that this is sponsored content.
The CCPA guidelines say that the celebrities and influencers need to provide proof of due diligence. Legally, what does this mean, Bharat?
So what the guidelines say on this is that the influencer can say in his or her defense that I've exercised due diligence if their opinion or their endorsement, number one, reflects their genuine opinion of the product and their reasonably current opinion of the product. And if their endorsement or their due diligence or their endorsing a product is based on adequate information about the product or experience with the product. So if they've used the product themselves, then that may be one defense. And if they are saying what they are saying bases their own experiences with the product, then that may be a defense. Then it may be said that the influencer has exercised due diligence. What they are saying has weight and credibility because they have experience with the product. But not in all cases an experience may be there, or the influencer may have used the product themselves. In some cases, if the influencer has adequate information about the product, has done the background research, has tested the veracity of what the manufacturer is saying by asking some probing questions on the specifications, the ingredients, the qualities, and the characteristics of the product that they're endorsing. And they've made that attempt to get adequate information and to be reasonably informed before they endorse. These are the things that may help an influencer take the defense of due diligence. Now, what should be the scope of this scrutiny? How deep should this probe be? Is something that the guidelines do not answer, and this is a bit of a gray area. To what extent the influencer needs to go when investigating the product themselves. And this would be especially relevant in terms of technical products where the influencer may not have the wherewithal or the capacity or the understanding to really take a deep dive and understand the product really well. So there are some questions unanswered, but I think as we go along and we have courts ruling on these issues, we'll have more clarity in terms of what is expected from an influencer.
So, Gautam, how much has the regulatory environment changed since you started Mad Influence 4 years back?
Influencer marketing even today is kind of not so organized, and it's going to take a little more time in terms of working from a regulation perspective with these influencers. But in the last 1 year, we have seen a lot of changes, and I think it will formalize in a much better way. Brands are taking it seriously. It's going to become in the next 3 years 22,000 crore industry, influencer marketing itself.
Tax experts I spoke to say the new rule brings transparency to the creator and influencer driven models and is in a way recognition by the government that the profession is a bona fide contributor to the economy. Anusha, from an agency standpoint, what's changed in the last 1 or 2 years?
Even 5-6 years ago, there was no clear regulatory guideline for us. Everybody was exploring the platform. There was not much for us. But I noticed a lot of brands who did a lot of self-regulatory guidelines for themselves on how they would behave, how they would talk. But as time passed and as people understood how the digital and social media platforms started to work, which is when we saw the participation of the regulatory bodies participating. It's all happened in the last 2 years. I saw a lot of brands making the early move to kind of self-regulate themselves, specifically companies in the alcohol industry, for example, a lot of guidelines, and they did that for themselves. They didn't need somebody to tell them really. But as time passed and people started to understand the space, we saw a lot more participation, contribution coming in the form of guidelines.
Categories like cryptocurrencies and NFTs are gray areas. In fact, crypto violations have been rampant. ASCII says influencers were responsible for 92% of crypto ad violations between January and June this year. So from that point of view, do you think there's a lot of work to be done?
Definitely. These newer industries and categories will go through a lot more change. I see a lot happening here. It's really new. Even the digital industry and the social media marketing industry, which existed for so many years. We saw early social media wave beginning in 2009 in India. It's taken us so many years to even understand the space and put together some guidelines. You will see the same happening with the crypto industry.
The Indian influencer creator market is worth $120 million, according to a Collapster report. Thanks to cheap data and budget smartphones, the influencers are all over the place. As for the famous endorsers selling us everything from cosmetics to cars to insurance to education, the new guidelines bring in first-time parameters including legal liabilities and equity disclosures. A lot will depend on interpretation and enforcement. But the months ahead are certainly not going to be the same for millions of influencers and endorsers. Thank you for joining us, Anusha, Bharat and Gautam. For now, we're signing off. I'm Ratna Bhushan, and you've been listening to Socially Acceptable Influencers Get a Reality Check on the Morning Brief. This episode was produced by Sumit Pandey from The Economic Times and Swati Joshi from Awaz. Sound editor Rajas Naik from The Economic Times and Saundarya Jayachandran from Awaz. Executive producers Anupriya Bahadur and Arijit Barman from The Economic Times. We hope you enjoyed listening to the episode. Do share the episode on your social media networks. The Morning Brief airs every Tuesday, Thursday and Friday. Do tune into ET Play, our latest platform for all audio content, including the Morning Brief. All external sound clips used in this episode belong to their respective owners. Credits are mentioned in the description. Thank you for listening and have a nice day ahead.